Today we're making pumpkin fruit roll-up. So delicious. Hi, I'm Getty from GettyStewart.com and I can't wait to get started on these roll-ups. What we've got going here is some pumpkin puree, applesauce, apple pie spices, and a little bit of honey. We're going to mix those up and put them in our dehydrator, and in the end we're going to have this delicious fruit roll-up. So I've had about 2 cups of pumpkin puree. Mine happened to be in the freezer, so I put it in this mesh to reduce some of the moisture in there so that it'll dry a little bit quicker. Mine comes straight from the pumpkin, so I know that it is still a little bit stringy. Now I want to remove those strings, so I'm going to put it in my immersion blender container and make it fine. So there I go. Move this to the side. And it's not going to take very long. That's all I need for to get this pumpkin puree looking nice and smooth. So I'm going to steal the scraper here, and I'm just going to start putting it into the big bowl. And at this point, we're going to mix the applesauce and the pumpkin puree. Right now, my pumpkin puree has no flavoring. My applesauce has no flavoring whatsoever. It's just cooked down pumpkin. So we're going to have to add a little flavor to this combination. My applesauce, same thing. It's just apples that have been cooked down. So along the way, we're going to have to do a little bit of taste testing to see what this is going to taste like. In dehydrated food like these roll-ups, the flavor is going to get more intense because we're removing the water from the food. So we need to consider that when we're making our spice combo. So there we have some beautiful pumpkin puree. It's nice and smooth since we used that immersion blender, and we're going to add the applesauce. Now, as you can see, I'm not too worried about exact quantities here. This happened to be the amount of apples I had left in the freezer that I just cooked down into an applesauce, and this happened to be the amount of pumpkin. But I do think that sort of double the amount of apples, or just slightly more apples than pumpkin puree, is probably going to get you a really nice flavor. So we're just going to mix these together. You can do this by hand, or you could use the immersion blender for this as well. So there we have it, nicely blended together, applesauce and pumpkin puree. You can't even tell really that there is pumpkin puree in here, and that might be a benefit for some of your tasters. I know my kids probably would prefer that. Now at this point, it's important to take a little taste. And it's like, okay, so I have the distinct apple flavor. There's a little something else going on in there. That's the pumpkin. So now I'm going to introduce some of the spice. This is my homemade apple pie blend. It's a mix of cinnamon and nutmeg and a little bit of cloves, and also some ginger. It smells delicious. So I'm going to add that. I'm going to add half a teaspoon just to start. And then I'll see where do I want to go from there. I also want to add a touch of sweetness. Now you really need to go by taste here, because some apples and some pumpkins are a little bit sweeter than others. So you decide. I'm going to start with about a tablespoon. And again, there is no right or wrong. You decide what works best for you and what flavors you'd like. And I'm going to blend that all together. Again, I could keep my immersion blender and do it all in there, but this isn't too tedious, so I think I'll be just fine mixing it by hand. And I'm going to keep mixing and trying and tasting just to see until I have the right flavor. Taste test. And that tastes about right to me. So the next step is to get this onto our dehydrator sheets, and I use the Paraflex sheet that came with my dehydrator. You could also use parchment paper, which I often do. If you want to do this in the oven, you can do that as well. You can line a big cookie sheet with parchment paper and bake it at the lowest possible setting, 150 degrees or so, for 8 to 10 hours. So it does use up your oven space for sure. So now I am going to put a little bit of that right on the bottom, and I have an offset spatula that makes it nice and easy for me just to smooth it out and spread it from corner. I am trying to get it as thin as possible, but also as even as possible. What we don't want is wet spots when we're dehydrating something like a fruit leather. So we want a nice even spread. And that's more important than worrying about exactly how thick or thin. Just as long as it's consistent and fairly thin, you're going to be all right. Now the offset spatula really helps with this. It's a little bit like decorating a cake. But I've also used the rubber spatula to try and smooth it out. There's a few more bumps, but nothing too much to worry about. So, and this happens to be quite a dry mixture for something like applesauce and pumpkin puree. So it stays on there nicely. I have dehydrated things that are a lot runnier, where I wouldn't dare hold up the tray like this. But this will dry quite nicely. And so I just slide it in my dehydrator. I'm going to repeat the process until all my puree is gone. Slide it into my dehydrator, set it to 135 Fahrenheit, which is about 60 degrees Celsius. And 4 or 5 sheets will probably take 6 to 8 hours. So I'm going to check at that point and see how far I have to go. The exact time that it's going to take to dehydrate these is going to change considerably depending on where you live, how humid things are outside, how thick, your type of dehydrator, and so forth. So always make sure that you're checking your food at the lowest possible temperature or time length, and just see how are things going, how are they progressing. If you do end up making your fruit leather a little too crispy, you can always soften it a little bit by adding a sheet of wet paper towel to your dehydrator, leaving it off, but just putting in that wet piece of paper towel will start to rehydrate your fruit leather and soften it a little bit if that happens to be a concern. You're best off to over dry than to under dry. If there are any wet spots left on your fruit leather, you really run the risk of having mold get into your entire batch, and you've gone through too much work to have that happen. So rather err on the side of done too well, dried too much, than under dried. With that, I wish you good luck as I continue to fill my dehydrator.